Today, we're going to be breaking down everything you need to know to shoot in Canon Log 3. We're going to be looking at what is Canon Log 3, how do you expose for it, when and why you should or should not use it, and finally, how to color grade to get the most out of it. To understand C-Log 3 properly, we first need to talk a little bit about dynamic range. Dynamic range is the range between the brightest and darkest parts of an image that your camera can capture without losing any detail. Take this camera for example, the Canon R6. The R6 has a sensor that is capable of capturing 14.3 stops of dynamic range, so that means as long as we're shooting a scene that has 14 stops or less of light difference between the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows, everything is going to be recorded. Now, if we were to shoot a scene that has 16 stops of exposure difference, now I'm gonna need to make a decision whether to either save the highlights and lose some shadow detail, or save the shadows and lose some highlight detail. Now, you might be thinking 14 stops, that's a lot of latitude. And it is, but there's a problem. This level of dynamic range is only really possible when shooting in 12-bit RAW. Most cameras will shoot 12-bit RAW photos, but only cinema cameras are gonna do that when it comes to video. So how do we squeeze this large amount of information into a smaller, compressed file that mirrorless cameras can handle? That is where Canon Log comes in. C-Log, like other log profiles, is a way to maximize dynamic range that your sensor can capture by lifting up those shadows in mid-range and then squeezing down those highlights to create a file that is compressed, but still holds all of that exposure and color info. If you don't shoot in log, your camera is going to process your footage using a linear color workflow, also known as Rec 709 or BT 709. At best, Rec 709 is going to give you around 5 stops of recorded dynamic range, and so even if you have a camera with a sensor that is capable of 14 stops, all of that extra information is being thrown out well before it ever hits your memory card. This isn't to say you should shoot everything in log. I personally do, but there are times when Rec 709 might be the better option. Knowing the situations when you're going to want to use C-Log 3 and what situations you might not want to is part of being a filmmaker. Some situations where I would recommend using C-Log 3 would be if you have a scene that has a high dynamic range. Maybe you have a room with a window in it, or you're shooting outside on a sunny day with harsh shadows. If you don't have full control of your lighting, like if you're outdoors, shooting in C-Log 3 is going to be your best chance to capture all of that information. Another reason would be if you plan on color grading your footage in post. Shooting in a flatter profile like C-Log 3 is going to give you the flexibility to use creative LUTs or color space transforms. It also gives you the ability to adjust the white point, black point, make curve adjustments, and overall just push and pull the image more than if it was a straight out of camera Rec 709 image. Now, there might be situations where you might not want to use C-Log 3. Maybe your footage has to be directly uploaded and posted, and you don't have the ability to color correct it. Maybe you're using your camera for live streaming or as a webcam for video conferencing. In these cases, having an image that is ready to go straight out of the camera is important, since log images do need to be color graded. For myself and for most of you watching, the majority of the time C-Log 3 is going to make the most sense, but it's also important to know what kind of occasion that you might want to shoot in Rec 709. So let's talk about setting it up. First, you're going to want to enable C-Log 3 in your camera. To do so, navigate to the Canon Log settings menu and select Canon Log 3. Most cameras are also going to allow you to adjust the color matrix or gamma curve. For this, you're going to want to select Cine Gamma, more on this one later. Now, even though C-Log 3 offers more dynamic range, you need to be careful when it comes to exposing for it. Luckily, there are several built-in exposure tools that make this process a whole lot easier, starting with View Assist. View Assist is a feature that applies a viewing LUT to your display. This sort of simulates how your footage is going to look after color grading. It doesn't affect the final recorded footage, it's purely just a visual aid. I also found that if I'm trying to dial in my white balance or get an idea of what the final image might look like, toggling this on and off is a great way to do that. And if you don't typically shoot in log, trying to compose or dial in your image while looking at a flat gray screen might be challenging, so this can help with that as well. The next and most important tool in my opinion is the histogram. To activate this, you're gonna wanna go to the Shooting Info Display menu option and toggle on Histogram. This is a fantastic tool and one that I use 100% of the time. C-Log 3 is very sensitive to highlights, more so than shadows, so you want to pay special attention to the right side of the histogram to make sure nothing is getting clipped. A good general practice with C-Log 3 is expose middle gray around 35 to 40%, and your highlights should never exceed 80%. If you're having trouble getting this right, try using the zebras function. Zebras can be found on the same menu page as histogram. I would set your zebra 1 to 35% for middle gray and zebra 2 to 80% for your highlights. You can then map this button to the camera body so you can quickly toggle this on and off. Another useful tool is the spot meter. In the center of the viewfinder and rear LCD screen, you're gonna see a bar with an indicator on that. This is essentially your camera looking at the entire image and then assigning an overall exposure value to that. Now, some people dismiss this, and I understand why, because it can be misleading from time to time. Let's say it's snowing out or you have a lot of sky in your image. The camera is going to meter the scene as overexposed, even if your subject is properly exposed. That being said, most of the time the camera does a pretty good job. Generally, I find myself keeping the overall scene around +1 EV or one stop above middle gray. Now, I do this because when it comes to exposing C-Log 3, it's better to use the ETTR method. ETTR, or exposed to the right, simply means to push your exposure to the brighter side of the histogram without clipping your highlights. And we do this because the brighter areas of an image are going to have more data, they're going to retain cleaner details, and they're also going to have the least amount of noise. Now, as you've probably noticed, getting the right exposure isn't as easy as it might sound. Exposing to the right, making sure your highlights are around 80%, checking the overall luminance of the scene. By getting used to and using the multiple exposure tools, you can make sure that the image being captured is going to look good for whenever you get back and start editing. Now, one last thing when it comes to exposing for C-Log 3, and this is sort of unique to shooting in log, but you want to make sure that you shoot C-Log 3 at its native base ISO. If you're coming from the photography world, the lower you can keep your ISO, the better the resulting image is going to look. And while this makes logical sense, it's not true when it comes to shooting in log. C-Log 3 has a base ISO of 800, meaning if you want the cleanest possible image with the most amount of dynamic range, you're going to want to shoot with your camera set to 800 ISO. Now, we can still raise and lower the ISO. It just means that as you get further away from the base of 800, the camera sensor is going to record less and less dynamic range. If you have histograms enabled, you can actually visually see this decrease in dynamic range as you slowly drop down to 100 ISO. The more that you can shoot at the native base of 800, the better your footage is going to look. Once we've captured our footage, now it's time to color grade it. There are two main methods when it comes to color grading. The first and least precise method is just the good old manual adjustments. Using curves, you can set the black point and white point. We can add contrast, boost saturation. This is a quick way to bring back the image, but it's not very precise when it comes to color management and the ability to export this footage to various formats. The next and my preferred method is using transform LUTs or doing a color space transform. Canon provides official LUTs designed for C-Log 3. If you go to their website, choose your camera model, and then go down to support, you'll be able to download these LUTs for your own use. When it comes to applying these, you're gonna need to know what log profile and what color space your footage was shot in. In our case, that's gonna be Canon Cinegamut C-Log 3, and what color space we wanna transform into. In most cases, that's gonna be Rec 709 wide DR. Another thing to note for final color, you're gonna wanna use the 65 grid 3D LUTs for the best results. If your computer struggles with these, try going down to 33 grid, but you're gonna lose a little bit of quality in the process. Once applied, we now have an accurate baseline conversion to start from. The color, contrast, white point, black point, this is all set using the transform LUT. Now we can go back and make any fine-tune adjustments. Maybe we didn't nail the exposure or the white balance. This is where you can make any small changes. One of my favorite tools is the HSL secondary. If you have a sky that might be a little too bright or an area of the image that might be a little too dark, the HSL secondary is a great tool to help with this. From here, we're gonna add adjustment layers over top of our footage, and this is where we can add any creative adjustments. This is where you can adjust your HSL's curves, add tint to the highlights or shadows with the color wheels, mess around with the luma and saturation. This is where your footage starts to take on that personal feel. This is also where you can add in any creative LUTs. I have several LUTs I've created over the years based on my style to help speed up my color grading process. There is no right or wrong here. Experiment and find what looks good to you. The main takeaway is you want to get your footage to a place that technically feels right. The highlights are bright but not blown out, the shadows are dark but not completely crushed, the colors look nice and natural, and then use this as a base to build off for your own look. Shooting in C-Log 3 might seem intimidating, but if you want to have flexibility over how your footage looks and feels, learning how to shoot C-Log 3 correctly is going to take your footage to the next level. Once you master exposing and grading, the results are going to follow. If you have any questions about shooting, grading, or anything else C-Log 3, leave those in a comment down below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another one.